We're talking tonight about the elder and his community and the relationship that an elder might have in the community where he lives. And there's 7 qualities that we're looking at this evening. So if you'll follow along with us in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1, we'll try to explain what these qualifications or qualities are that are important to the elder. But I've already said that these qualifications are really good for all Christian men to try to attain to, and even Christian women in a lot of cases, because these really are the standard of what God expects of his people. And so, as we pointed out last week, Paul left Titus in Crete so that he might set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every church. And the way the preacher does his part in appointing elders is to teach the qualifications, show what God expects of the leaders of the church, and then to ask each of us to examine our own lives and be sure we're living up to those standards. And if perchance you find someone that you think is qualified, pass that name on to our elders. And it's interesting that elders do have a relationship to the community. I know that when people have gone, especially in smaller towns where you have a more tight-knit community, a preacher or an elder or a member can so misbehave to cause the whole church to have a black eye, so to speak. Because you go talk to somebody and they say something about one of your members, and you say, oh yes, he goes where I preach, and they say, you mean he's a Christian? And it might be that the fellow asking the question does the same thing he does, but he doesn't go to church, doesn't profess to be a Christian. That's exactly what God is warning us about in the Bible regarding our conduct and the conduct of all of us as Christians, as human beings. We need to realize that we are reflections upon God and Christ and the church when we act the way we do. Well, the first thing we're looking at tonight in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 2 is that a bishop must be blameless. We've already looked at this qualification, I think, before, but again it applies in this same context. The King James translates it blameless and unrebukable. And the word literally means not apprehended, one who cannot be laid hold of, one who cannot be reprehended or open to censure, irreproachable. So if you wanted to give a definition, and by the way, I look at that, and that's Strong's, and then I looked at Thayer's, and it says the same thing, and Vines says the same thing, and I'm still scratching my head. I'm saying, how does the definition make it more confusing than the actual word itself? And then, of course, Vincent in his word study says, without reproach, one who cannot be laid hold of, who gives no ground for accusation. So if you wanted to sum that up very basically, you just simply say somebody who has a good reputation in the community. Now, that doesn't mean that sometimes good people have been accused of things that aren't true. Jesus was accused repeatedly throughout his earthly ministry, and everything he was accused of was false. And so you say, well, then he was not blameless. Yes, he was, because an accusation and proving it are not the same thing. So you might find a qualified man who has in the community someone who has something against him, or someone who may have an accusation, and you need to investigate that. But blameless simply means someone who has, in general, a good reputation. As we said, Jesus' personal life was above reproach, as we know, and in John 8:46, toward the end of his ministry, he asked the Jews who wanted to kill him, which of you convicts me of sin? And none of them could, and when he was tried, many false witnesses came up against him, and none of those charges were able to uphold in court. And so it's obvious that the idea here is that there will be no shame or embarrassment brought upon the church when that man is put in a position of leadership and the community hears about that. And so that's a matter of character. How does he act when he's confronted with his own personal wrongs or when he's tried or tested? And it's also obvious that this does not exclude a man who may have sinned and then amended his ways. Peter was an apostle who obviously, before he became what we call an official apostle, denied Jesus, but he was restored. And then in the case of Paul, accusing him to his face, he was to be blamed, but we assume that he was able to make that right. So blameless doesn't mean you've never done anything wrong. It does mean you corrected the mistakes you've made in your life. Amen. And so that's important to remember as well. So I think that's fairly easy for us to understand. The second one is not violent, from a Greek word which literally means not a striker. 1 Timothy 3:3, Titus 1:7. It appears 2 times in the New Testament and translated in the King James Version, not a striker, both times. Well, does that mean somebody who literally is a fighter? And again, the definition is bruiser, ready for a blow, pugnacious, contentious, quarrelsome person. So it does have the concept of a literal fighter. Some people solve their problems with their fists. You ever known somebody like that? Have you ever known anybody in the church like that? When I was about 14 years old, we lived in Conway, Arkansas, and one of my friends came to school on a Monday or Tuesday and said, "You hear what happened out at Mount Vernon?" This is a church outside of Conway, about 30 miles. I said, "No." So they got in a big fight on the front porch of the church building. And I said, "You're kidding." I didn't believe it. I never heard of such. No, they really did. And all I could think of was, well, I knew why he told me, because I'm a member of the church and he knew it, so it was kind of embarrassing. But I've seen situations like that and heard of them before. When I preached in another town, there was a fellow who was the husband of one of our members, and he was a member too, but the best you could say about Jack is that he was a nominal member. He was there because his wife wanted him to be. And he did everything to let everybody know he didn't care for being there. He drove a Coca-Cola truck, had arms like a tree trunk, and he sat on the last row, and he'd lay his head back on the pew and go sound asleep before I ever got up there, so I didn't take the credit for putting him to sleep. But one of our young members, because I was young at the time, Vince and I were about 25 years old, he came to me and says, "Do you see Jack back there asleep?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Isn't that shameful?" I said, "It sure is." He said, "Somebody needs to do something about it." I said, "Well, have you talked to the elders?" He said, "Yes." I said, "What did they say?" They said, "Leave him alone." I said, "Well, what did you decide?" He said, "Well, I came to you." I said, "Well, I think I'd take the elders' advice and leave him alone." He said, "I just don't think that's right." I said, "Well, Vince, why don't you go talk to him?" So he did, and between Bible class and worship, and after services, he came up to me, and he was white as a sheet. And I said, "Did you talk to Jack?" He said, "Yeah, I did." I told him it's a shame and disgrace that he fell asleep during church when everybody could see him. I said, "What did he say?" He said, "Do you want to meet me outside?" And I said, Vince is about 6 feet tall and weighed about 165 pounds. I said, "You didn't go out, did you?" I should have known the answer because he wouldn't have come back in. There's a fellow that's how he solved his problems. "I'll just beat you up, then you'll leave me alone." I told Vince, "Vince, you should leave him alone. Some people you can't help." And there's more stories about Jack than that, but it does show you that can be an issue. Some brethren who might have wonderful qualities in a lot of other ways might think that the best way to solve their problems is just duke it out on the backyard. And so it has also, and maybe more applicable, is the figurative meaning of contentious or quarrelsome person. You've heard of people who, they say, "Well, he'll fight at the drop of a hat." And someone says, "Yeah, and he'll drop the hat." People just like to argue to be arguing. And a man who's going to be an elder doesn't need to be that personality. And so we need to keep in mind that there's both the figurative sense. Diotrephes loved to have preeminence in the brethren in 3 John 9, and he'd probably be disqualified as an elder on this basis right here. And so we don't want to have that quality in the eldership or leadership. And even as a Christian, that person needs to work hard on what he's doing. But how many of you listened to that thought, "Well, I would never be that violent. I wouldn't hurt somebody"? And if you're thinking that, and I'm thinking that, stop and think a minute about the first murder. Cain killed his brother Abel. You ever feel like you could have done what Cain did? And hopefully everybody says, "No, that's not how I would think." Well, it's not how I think either. I'm the exact opposite. I'll go out of my way not to cause trouble. But it's interesting that Cain early on didn't have an example of what not to do, and that sometimes we're closer to the issue of violence than we want to admit. And it reminded me of a story I read just recently in this book by by Gene Getz called The Measure of a Man. And he describes the fact that all of us as human beings are not too far away from being murderers ourselves. And I thought, I don't know if I agree with that or not. But anyway, he described how, being a German himself whose family immigrated to America, he said, I didn't feel comfortable with the fact that I'm of German heritage, knowing what Hitler and all his men did. And so he raises this question. I'd like to read some of it. He says, we all have the same capacity to engage in violence toward our fellow human beings and to follow the leadership of violent men, Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, and Saddam Hussein. Maybe these men were psychologically ill as well as spiritually degenerate, but why did hordes of men and women who were mentally and emotionally sound follow them and carry out their orders? Whether you can accept it or not, the Bible teaches that all human beings have the same potential. And so he describes an example of that. Chuck Colson related a story in 60 Minutes years ago about Adolf Eichmann. How many of you know who that fellow is? I read the book about Adolf Eichmann when I lived in Kilgore, Texas, and it raised a great moral question. How can a man who's directly responsible for killing literally millions of Jews ever receive a just punishment in this world? Because life that sheds life should be taken. But if you kill 10 million people, how do you punish that fellow for that? So he was on trial in about 1960, and one of his survivors met him face to face in the trial, and this is what he's describing. He said, how can a man act like that? Was he a monster, a madman, or was he perhaps something even more terrifying, normal? Normal. The execution of millions of Jews, normal? Most self-respecting viewers would be outraged at the very thought. But the most startling answer to Wallace's shocking question came in an interview with Yehiel Dainur, a concentration camp survivor, who testified against Eichmann at the Nuremberg trials. A film clip from Eichmann's 1961 trial showed Dainur walking into the courtroom, stopping short and seeing Eichmann for the first time since the Nazis had sent him to Auschwitz 18 years earlier. Dainur began to sob uncontrollably and then fainted and collapsing in a heap on the floor as the presiding judicial officer pounded his order in the crowded courtroom. Was he overcome by hatred, fear, horrid memories? No, it was none of these. Rather, as Dainur explained, all at once he realized Eichmann was not the godlike officer who had sent so many to their deaths. This Eichmann was an ordinary man. I was afraid about myself, he said. I saw that I am capable to do this. I am exactly like he. So that's something to think about, isn't it? Being a Christian and trying to behave like a Christian, we can walk a fine line, and it doesn't take a lot for somebody who's living a very reputable life all of a sudden to step across the line and become something he never intended to be. So keep that in mind. Why strive for that which is higher? Because if you don't, you're going to go down to that which is lower. Christianity is a lifestyle that's always climbing upward, and if we begin to level out and say, well, I'm satisfied with where I am now, you don't go horizontally, you go down. So we're always growing upward or always growing downward. And so you should ask yourself in the last year, last 5 years, am I spiritually and morally growing better or worse? Because that's the option we have. And so these qualifications are good from that standpoint alone. It challenges us to be better than maybe normal people would ordinarily want to be. A third one is not quarrelsome. And again, the King James Version uses not a brawler. So you think those two qualifications are almost identical, which I think they are. Like I've said, one is in Timothy and another one is in Titus, and so they're comparable, if not exactly the same. So once again, this is a fellow not to be withstood, invincible, not contentious, abstaining from fights. And so you're not to be quarrelsome. The fellow who says it's my way or no way, the highway or my way, is what we're trying to avoid. Marvin Vincent, in his discussion in his dictionary says someone who's not contentious. So again, we've seen that, but obviously that doesn't mean what Jude 3 said. He said there we should earnestly what? Contend for the faith once delivered to the saints. So a contentious man is one who contends over his personal judgment, over his personal opinion. One of the realm in which elders operate is the realm of judgment. And if one elder is contentious so that his opinion, his judgment has to be what everybody thinks or he's not satisfied, would be a difficult fellow to work with, as you might could see. We go on, and the next one is not quick-tempered. From the Greek word orgelos, from which we get our English word orgy, and the idea is that which is violent and explosive, whether you're talking about a sexual explosion or whether you're talking about somebody's temper exploding. And so a quick-tempered man is simply someone who's prone to anger. He has a quick temper. He reacts very quickly. And so this man is able to control himself under normal circumstances. It doesn't mean that if a fellow is going to be an elder and you keep pushing and pushing and pushing and gets mad that, oh, well, he's quick-tempered. No, he's slow-tempered. Everybody has a limit to which they should be pushed. So what it's saying here is not quick-tempered. Under normal circumstances, he doesn't lose his temper. And so that's important to distinguish, because sometimes it's important to lose your temper. The Lord became angry and overthrew the money changers in the temple, but we wouldn't say because of that he was unqualified. Wiest makes an interesting observation about this. He says he can be angered, but it takes great unreasonable exertion by others. And so we want to be sure that we're not the one pushing the buttons. You know, I hear husbands and wives say, well, I know what buttons to push. Or a husband says, I know what buttons to push. Well, that's not right either, is it? And so we want to be sure we're not part of that process. Then, not greedy for money. The King James Version, which I like better, says not greedy for filthy lucre. Growing up as a kid, I had no idea what filthy lucre was, but I knew I didn't want to touch it because I didn't like filthy things. Kind of like that song we were singing tonight. Here I raised my Ebenezer, and I thought, well, I don't know where mine is. It's somewhere between my elbow and my knee, Ebenezer. You all do know what that means, don't you? Joe doesn't. It means rock or stone of help. But as a kid, nobody told me, and I was afraid to ask. So filthy lucre doesn't mean something that's literally dirty. It simply means someone who is trying, because of his love of money, will gain it any way possible. And the filthy lucre part is he doesn't mind doing it in an illegal way. A lot of our famous businessmen have a very sordid past because they were greedy for money. They were greedy for filthy lucre. They didn't care how they obtained it as long as they got it, because money means power. And so obviously elders who are always deciding on money decisions can't be guilty of loving money too much themselves. So there's two qualities here that we're looking at. One who is greedy for money to the point of doing something wrong, but also someone who will obtain it by unethical means because he simply loves money itself. And so it's good to have money. It's good to use it wisely. It's not wrong to be rich. Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy 6, charge those who are rich in this world not to be arrogant or high-minded. And so we know that's understandable. But when you accomplish that by illegal means or questionable means, or you don't care how you go about doing it, then obviously that's not good either. You must love the souls of men more than you love money itself. And so those who inordinately desire money will go to unethical means to obtain it. And if you look in the Old Testament prophets, one of the great problems they had, and even Jesus mentioned this to the Pharisees in Matthew 23, is that they robbed poor widows. And if you haven't seen that, go back to Amos, or one of those minor prophets we call them, and see how many times men of stature would go to widows or orphans and take away what belonged to them. And that would mean they're unqualified, ungodly men. Others are unethical in their business practices, and they say, well, that's just how the business world is. Not for the Christian, it's not. And so we have a problem with that all of our lives as human beings. Paul said in Ephesians 4:28 to the good brethren at Ephesus, let him who stole steal no longer. You mean there's some good Christians in there who haven't quit stealing? You know, if they haven't, there's the danger of doing it because he said you need to stop it. And it's interesting that a thief is very covetous. And so the solution for overcoming covetousness is you face your in Ephesians 4:28 it goes so far to say, let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him work with his hands in order that he may have something to give to him who has need. If you're covetous, make money and then give it away. Be sure you control money, it doesn't control you. Help others who are in need. And that's what Paul told the rich in 1 Timothy 6. Be rich in good works, willing to distribute, willing to share. Because we begin to hoard what we have and to keep what we've got tightly, then we become guilty of loving money a little bit too much. Somebody says, well, I don't know any Christians who would do this. I know two outstanding examples. One man that I know very well bought 49% ownership of a quick stop that sold liquor in the store. And his explanation was, well, I'm not the major owner of the company. I said, no, but you're gaining wealth by it because everybody knows these quick trip stores make more money off of liquor than any other product they sell in the store. So if you want to get rich quick, open up a little quick stop out in the country somewhere and load it full of liquor and you'll get rich real quick, but you won't be accepted by God. In Longview, Texas, I heard of a man who obeyed the gospel, became a Christian, except he worked at the Bush refinery. And so he wanted to know, what should I do? And the elders told him, you can't keep doing that and be a Christian, so he quit his job. There's a man who put spiritual things above financial interest, and that's a big challenge because in the place where he lived, jobs like that, which paid very well, were not very common. And so we see the value of, as Christians, not being greedy for money. And that's not just elders, that's all of us. We have to be careful about how much we love money and all the things that money might bring. Then we come to not given to wine. Of the translation, the King James, I think, is not given to much wine. 1 Timothy 3:3, Titus 1:7. Strong's defines this word as being given to wine or drunken. But keep in mind that wine is predominantly used of unfermented grape juice. That's how it was used in this first century and even in ancient times. But it's used both as a beverage and as a medicine. It does have a secondary use. And as Timothy was told to take a little wine for his stomach's sake, it tells you in 1 Timothy 5:23 that he was an abstainer. And the Good Samaritan poured oil and wine on the wounded man that he found by the roadside, Luke 10 and verse 34. And so we have to keep in mind that as wine grew old, it fermented, and it could then make one drunk. And obviously that is condemned in the Bible repeatedly from the Old Testament to the New. For example, in Isaiah 5 and verse 11, it says, woe to those who rise early in the morning that they may follow intoxicating drink, who continue until night till wine inflames them. And to show you how that very attitude was rejected by common society, you'll remember in Acts 2 when the apostles began to speak in other tongues, at 9 o'clock in the morning they were accused of being what? Drunken. And Peter said, we're not drunken, seeing it is but the third hour of the day, 9 a.m. That wasn't typical. And so those who are guilty of this are the ones who rise up early in order to obtain that wine. In the New Testament, in Romans chapter 13 and verse 13, the Apostle Paul tells us that we need to make a distinction in our lives between what we pursue and what we do not. Let us walk properly as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lewdness and lust, not in strife and envy. So in that verse, how many of those things can a Christian practice a little bit? Can I practice a little bit of revelry, a little bit of drunkenness, a little bit of lewdness, or a little bit of lust? Obviously, those things are opposite the Christian life, because he said those things, including strife and envy, are not walking properly. Those are carnal things. And in contrast, he says in verse 14, put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lust. So how does a Christian avoid being drunk? You never take the first drink. That's my plans, one I worked on all my life. And I think that's what's being referred to here. Elders must not be subject to wine or other intoxicating liquors or chemicals or drugs. And so anything that makes you not sober-minded, anything that controls you, you can see the value of that. You don't want an elder who can't control his own habit, whether it's drinking or pills or whatever, and you want him in a role of leadership telling us how we should behave. Obviously, he needs to learn to control himself before he tries to help others. And I think we could all understand the value of that. And notice what Jesus says about such things in Matthew chapter 12, verses 45 and 46. He said, then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and there the last state of that man is worse than the first. And he describes that of the man who begins the process of drinking. Galatians 5:21 says drunkenness is a work of the flesh. And so it's very important that we avoid that so we can save our souls. The New American Standard Version translates this word as not addicted to wine. And so again, there's the medicinal use of wine. There's the use of wine that's not fermented, and it's a healthy thing. A doctor told me one time that helps lower your cholesterol if you drink unfermented grape juice. And so there's a value to that, but obviously a little bit too much can put you in a bad place. The last one tonight, number 7, is a good testimony of those who are outside. Or the King James Version says, good report of those who are without. Good simply means that which is naturally good, good by nature and by characteristic. And testimony is that of one's ethical character. So again, this is very similar to the very first one we used of being blameless. And so we include all of these in the list so that we can be sure we have them all covered. Outwardly or outside would be the ones who are not members of the church and how they view us. And so in the community, a man who moves and works and walks among people should not have a reputation for being a habitual liar or an adulterer or a drug pusher or an alcoholic or one who escapes his debts and declares bankruptcy all the time. Those kind of things harm our reputation and therefore make us unqualified to serve as a leader in the church or in the community for that matter. And why does he say do that? It says, lest he fall into the snare and reproach of the devil. Satan is always looking for an opportunity to blame us and to accuse us and to find our weak spot and to challenge that. And so we're to be men of integrity as Christians. Our conduct is to be honorable. We're to be known for being upright and honest, and that's the character of all Christians, but especially those who are going to be the leaders of our congregation. And his conduct cannot cause others to question his commitment to Christ. And so that's what we're talking about in these qualifications, I think, apply to the elder and his community, how the world views us. So look over all of those. Be sure you understand them. And again, it's a great test for our own character to see how we are. Every Christian should be an example in the community, and this is what it means when Jesus says, you're the light of the world. You're the salt of the earth. Salt preserves the immorality in the community. If you're the salt, then you're above that. Light exposes that which is wrong and says this is not right. And you do that by the way you live your life. And people know that. And so Proverbs 22 and verse 1 says, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, loving favor rather than silver and gold. But if you mar your good reputation, then it takes years to build it back up again. Ecclesiastes 7 verse 1, a good name is better than precious ointment. And so you and I want to build a reputation and a character so that even when somebody does accuse us, those who know us best say, I know he would never do something like that. And so that's a good lesson for us. We should teach our children to follow these qualifications. So young men and young women, if you want to be godly, respectable human beings, this is how you conduct yourself. Avoid those who live otherwise and don't do it yourself, because you not only want to be a leader in the community and hopefully one day in the church, but you also want to be one who not only saves your soul, but helps others go there as well. That's what elders really are all about. They're watching over the flock, and the first job of an elder is take heed to yourself, then to all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseer. So to do that, you have to be able to control your own spirit, and in doing that, you save your soul and those who might hear you. Thank you for listening again tonight to this lesson, and I appreciate your kind attention. If you're not a child of God and you'd like to obey the gospel, maybe you see one reason for being a Christian is not just going to heaven, which is the ultimate goal, but also because it will make you a better person. The world doesn't hold the standards that Christianity does. And some people today would look at that and say, well, that's just impossible to keep. That's just too hard to do. It's not if your eyes set on the heavenly goal. It's not if you're looking to Jesus as your example. It's not if you're trying to follow the instruction of Jesus Christ. And so young people, aspire to these kind of characteristics. Don't try to cut yourself short by saying, well, I'm going to do all of these, but. Try to maintain a good, reasonable character and reputation, and that will serve you well in every aspect of your life. And so again, here they are. A good reputation, not a fighter, not contentious. You don't like to argue because it's your way or no way. Not violent or quick-tempered. Not eager for unethical gain. Not subject to intoxication. And a good testimony, when people mention your name, they say, oh, I know that fellow, he's a good person. And so those are the qualifications that fit the community in which you live, in which obviously this kind of character will cause people to think about, well, if I want to improve my life, I'm going to go where this brother attends, because look at his life. And that's what God wants us to do as well. So if you need to respond to the gospel in faith, repentance, confession, and baptism, you're aspiring to live a higher, better life than you would, and God will forgive you of all the past. And even as a Christian, when we fall short of these standards and err and sin, we repent of them, ask God to forgive us, and then we pick ourselves up and try again. Again, Christianity is the foolproof way of saving our souls and those who will listen to the gospel if we'll simply follow the instructions given. So if you'd like to respond in any way to the gospel tonight, won't you come while we stand and sing?